Welcome to Incentives Matter, your guide to what's new in behavioral science and behavioral economics. Let's see what's really driving decisions. For nearly 2 decades, the nudge has been the golden child of behavioral public policy. Small, low-cost tweaks to our environment, defaulting us into retirement savings, shrinking cafeteria plates, adding smiley faces to energy bills, all promising to solve big problems without the political friction of taxes or bans. It sounded like magic.
And it was, in many ways, an incredibly powerful idea. But now, two of the very architects of this movement, behavioral scientists Nick Chater and George Loewenstein, have published a blistering critique of their own field. They argue that behavioral science has become an unwitting accomplice to corporate interests, essentially providing intellectual cover for companies to lobby against meaningful regulation.
An unwitting accomplice? That's a pretty strong accusation coming from inside the tent. What's the core of their argument?
Their new book, It's On You, argues that by obsessively focusing on what they call the I-frame, individual-level interventions, the field has created a massive blind spot. And not just a blind spot, but an active distraction that diverts attention away from the S-frame, which is systemic-level interventions like regulations, taxes, and structural changes.
So it's not just that nudges are insufficient, but that they might actually be harmful by making us believe we're addressing issues when we're really not? That's a profound shift in thinking.
Precisely. And the data suggests it's not just a theoretical concern, it's a measurable phenomenon.
This isn't some external attack from cynics, then. This is an inside job, a reckoning from the very pioneers who helped build the behavioral public policy movement.
That's why their critique carries so much weight. Nick Chater is a professor of behavioral science at Warwick Business School, and George Loewenstein is at Carnegie Mellon, a truly foundational figure in behavioral economics. Both were instrumental in the early days, even serving on the advisory board of the UK's Behavioral Insights team, the original nudge unit. So they were right there, seeing it unfold from the very beginning. What did they observe that made them change their minds? Chater, in a recent interview, described their early efforts. We were struggling really hard to find things that worked and finding out that they just don't work. He mentioned Loewenstein's work trying to get people to exercise more or eat healthier, and his own attempts to persuade people to burn less carbon. The results from these individual-focused interventions, they concluded, were disappointingly modest. It's like they were looking for their keys under a street lamp because that's where the light was brightest, even if they dropped them somewhere else entirely. Their tools, psychology, nudges, shone brightest on individual behavior, but the real solutions were in the dark alleys of systemic regulation. That's an excellent analogy. Their core intellectual contribution in this critique is that framework, the I-frame versus the S-frame. The I-frame focuses on individuals, their biases, their choices. Think smaller food portions, automatic enrollment in green energy, recycling prompts. The S-frame deals with the system, sugar taxes, carbon pricing, mandatory fuel efficiency standards. And the big reveal is that by focusing so intensely on the I-frame, behavioral scientists essentially offered governments and corporations a get-out-of-jail-free card. Exactly. Loewenstein explained it in a Q&A. Firms have found that they can advance their own interests by promoting the I-frame while relentlessly lobbying for substantive S-frame policies that favor their own interests, where they know the true action lies. They weren't necessarily conspiring, but the outcome was the same. The field inadvertently handed massive PR victories to industries like fossil fuels and junk food.
So the argument is that this isn't just a recent phenomenon. Corporations have been doing this for decades, long before the nudge unit even existed.
Absolutely. Chater and Loewenstein actually trace this strategy back to the 1950s and 70s. This is where the historical true crime narrative begins, showing how the I-frame was weaponized to shift blame.
The source material points to a foundational example, Keep America Beautiful and the infamous crying Indian ad. How does that fit into this idea of weaponizing the I-frame?
It's a perfect illustration. In the mid-20th century, as packaging shifted from reusable glass to cheap, disposable materials, litter became a huge problem. States started considering bottle deposit laws to force manufacturers to take back their containers. Which would have been a classic S-frame intervention, right? Shifting the responsibility to the producers. Precisely. But a coalition of packaging companies, American Can, Owens Illinois Glass, and later Coca-Cola, saw this as a threat. So they quietly formed Keep America Beautiful, or CAB. Their hidden agenda was to block that structural legislation by promoting an iframe narrative. Pollution is a consumer behavior problem, not a manufacturing problem.
And that's where the crying Indian ad comes in. It's a memorable image, a single tear rolling down his cheek as a motorist throws trash at his feet.
It premiered on Earth Day in 1971. The ad's tagline, "People start pollution, people can stop it," perfectly encapsulated CAB's strategy. It made everyday Americans feel guilty for littering, while CAB's corporate funders were simultaneously spending millions to defeat state-level bottle bills. They successfully shifted the burden of waste management from the producers and legislators to individual consumers and local taxpayers.
That's a truly cynical but brilliant campaign, making individuals responsible for a problem caused by systemic industrial changes.
It set the playbook, and the fossil fuel industry, particularly BP, perfected it in the early 2000s.
This is the era of the personal carbon footprint, isn't it?
Yes, as public awareness of climate change grew, outright denial became a PR liability for BP. So in 2004, they hired Ogilvy and Mather, a massive public relations firm, to rebrand. And together, they popularized the concept of the personal carbon footprint.
The online calculator where you could figure out how driving to work, heating your home, or buying groceries contributed to global warming. It felt empowering at the time, this idea that your individual actions mattered.
It was a masterful sleight of hand. Chater noted that the trick is portraying governments as very bad while manipulating government actions, and simultaneously portraying the individual as the source of salvation, knowing full well that the individuals can do very little on their own. Being nudged to recycle or switch to green energy doesn't actually cut carbon at the scale required to avert climate disaster. Instead, it distracts the public from the real challenge, building a heavily regulated, low-carbon economy.
So these weren't just benign attempts to encourage better behavior. They were active strategies to deflect attention and prevent systemic change. But is there hard behavioral science data to back up this crowd-out effect, or is it mostly historical narrative and theoretical argument?
That's a crucial question. This is where the work of Hogman, Ho, and Loewenstein becomes particularly important. In a landmark 2019 study published in Nature Climate Change, they specifically investigated whether nudges act as a complement to structural policies or as a substitute that crowds out support for harder systemic changes.
Okay, so they asked, why not do both, nudge people to recycle and tax carbon?
Exactly. They ran 6 different experiments, presenting respondents with choices regarding environmental policy. The S-frame policy was a carbon tax, economically recognized as effective but politically difficult. The I-frame policy was a green energy nudge, automatically enrolling people in renewable energy plans.
And what did they find? The results were quite alarming. When the carbon tax was presented as the only option, 70% of participants supported its implementation. However, when participants were introduced to the potential for a green energy nudge as an alternative or complementary option, support for the carbon tax plummeted to just 55%. So the mere presence of the nudge, even if it's a good thing on its own, made people less likely to support the more impactful policy? That's genuinely counterintuitive.
It gets more surprising. They even ran the experiment on alumni of a public policy school, expecting that their specialized education might mitigate this effect. It did not. Not only did these experts replicate the drop in support for the carbon tax, but a majority of them incorrectly believed that the green energy nudge would actually be more effective at reducing emissions than the tax itself.
Let that sink in. People who are specifically trained to understand policy trade-offs still fell into this trap. What's the psychological mechanism at play here?
Hagman, Ho, and Loewenstein theorized that nudges provide a dangerous false hope. They offer the illusion of a quick fix, a painless, cost-free way to tackle massive societal problems. As Hagman explained, although nudges can effectively change behavior, most have too small an impact to address societal problems on their own. It appears that many people view them as substitutes for economic policies, instead of the complements they were always intended to be.
Human beings are naturally averse to sacrifice. If you offer them a choice between a painful systemic change, like a tax that makes gas more expensive, and a painless individual tweak, like a nudge that changes a default setting, they will eagerly latch on to the nudge.
And corporations know this. By loudly promoting I-frame solutions, they feed the public's desire for painless progress, thereby draining the political will required to pass the S-frame regulations that would actually hurt the corporation's bottom line. Loewenstein is quite stark about it. An effort to deploy nudges can backfire by reducing the likelihood that the most effective policies will be supported and implemented.
This is the most crucial takeaway for anyone interested in behavioral science. Nudges are not benign. So, for those trying to distinguish between a genuinely useful intervention and a corporate distraction, how does one do it? Is there a kind of nudge-washing litmus test?
Chater and Loewenstein's work provides exactly that. The report outlines 4 key questions to ask. First, the scale test. Does the proposed nudge match the scale of the problem? If we're talking about a global climate crisis and the solution is smaller plates or smart thermostats, it's likely an I-frame distraction.
That makes sense. A small solution for a massive problem is a red flag. What's next?
Second, the funder's veto. Who is funding or loudly promoting this intervention? If a green energy nudge is being pushed by a fossil fuel company or an anti-littering campaign by a plastics manufacturer, it's highly probable it's being used to crowd out S-frame regulation.
That's where the unwitting accomplice becomes a much more knowing one on the corporate side.
Third, the legislative shadow. Is the nudge being introduced precisely at the moment when a structural regulation is gaining political momentum? Think back to KAB launching the Crying Indian ad just as states were debating bottle deposit laws. It's a timing tells all.
A proactive defense against genuine change. And finally,
fourth, the transparency of impact. Does the intervention clearly state its limited impact? The Hagman study found a remedy to the crowd-out effect. When respondents were explicitly informed about the mathematically small impact of the nudge, support for the carbon tax rebounded. So, honest I-frame interventions must come with a disclaimer of their limitations.
That's a critical point. It's not about abandoning behavioral science, but about redirecting its immense intellectual power.
Precisely. It's on You concludes with a profound call to action for the behavioral science community. Instead of using psychology to tweak individual consumer behavior, scientists must pivot their skills to the SIS frame. They need to study how to design better, more politically palatable taxes and understand the cognitive biases of regulators, politicians, and corporate lobbyists.
It sounds like a new frontier for the discipline, moving from the micro to the macro, from individual choice architecture to systemic policy design.
The authors argue that the most important way in which behavioral scientists can contribute to public policy is by employing their skills to develop and implement value-creating system-level change.
So, considering this work, what are the big implications for the behavioral science world?
This really is a significant turning point. When the very architects of a movement declare that its foundational premise was a mistake, the entire field has to adapt or risk irrelevance. One big question is what happens to the 150 to 200 nudge units globally? Will they be given the mandate and the power to tackle SIS-frame systemic design, or will they be relegated to optimizing government forms and tax reminder letters? And can this crowd-out effect be weaponized in reverse? If corporations use nudges to kill taxes, can climate activists use the failure of nudges to prove that taxes are the only remaining option? That's a fascinating tactical question for advocates. And of course, there's the reaction from the old guard. Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein built an empire on the concept of the nudge. While they have acknowledged the need for systemic changes in recent editions of their work, Chater and Loewenstein's critique really strikes at the heart of the nudge philosophy. It will be interesting to see if this sparks a civil war within behavioral economics. For 20 years, behavioral economics told us a comforting story. We don't need to make hard sacrifices or fight entrenched corporate power. We just need to be a little bit smarter about how we design our cafeterias and our utility bills. And Chater and Loewenstein have finally called time on that illusion. The era of the painless nudge is over. The era of structural, systemic friction has begun. This leaves listeners with a lot to consider. When a small individual tweak feels good, what bigger, harder policy might it be distracting them from? And are consumers too willing to embrace the easy fix over the impactful one? That's all for this episode of Incentives Matter. Join us next time as we keep unpacking what really drives decisions. Thanks for listening. Choose wisely, or at least know why you didn't.